Let me explain. So Bond says that the reason he was playing fighters, PS3 fighters, 360 fighters on his standard definition television was because he was trying to combat lag, input lag, packet loss. While you weren't getting input lag, you also weren't getting your 60 frames per second that you like to clamor for and brag about. The reason why I was asking how old your TV was and what model was something pretty important. You say in your videos that all CRTs are created equal. No, 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 they're not. Especially when it comes to 60 frames per second. See, here's the thing that you, I guess, must not know, Bond. While you were playing on that old SD TV, yeah, you weren't getting any input lag, but you also weren't getting 60 frames per second. That TV that you were playing PS3 on, that SD TV, was so old that it didn't even have component support. And why is that important, you ask? Well, because without component, without HDMI, you can't do progressive scan. And guess what? Without progressive scan, you can't see a full 60 frames per second. Period. It's impossible. An interlaced signal will not show you a full 60 frames per second.
Rare footage of Daigo actually angry. Justin's turtle style. Overcome Rao. Now on the verge of putting Daigo down 1-0. Let's go, Justin!
And I'm going to expose you for the fraud that you are once and for all. And not just as a professional fraud, but as a personal fraud as well.
Wow, would you look at that? The greatest fighting game moment in history, and on a good old regular CRT. See, I'd like to say I'm confused, but I'm really not. See, this is the kind of stupidity that is normal for Trey. It's like breathing, walking, eating, sleeping. So he finally got around to responding to my CRT point on Twitter, and it's laughable. I mean, it's common knowledge that 7th Level and myself have been making fun of this clown over the whole Arcade Perfect thing on consoles. It is a fact that the Sega Saturn and the Sega Dreamcast could both achieve Arcade Perfect ports on those consoles. It is not debatable, it is a fact. And you know, those arcade games, man, it's surprising to me. Those arcade games, they ran at 60 frames per second. The same ones that the Saturn and the Dreamcast could perfectly emulate and port over to, and without the use of component cables. Yeah, about those things. I mean, any gamer worth their salt has been in the arcade. It's a common sense thing. See, by your claims though, Trey, all 2D games of the past ran at 30 frames per second, and we all know that's not true. You can go look up the frame data for games such as Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, Killer Instinct 2, all the Neo Geo fighting games, and all the frame data for all the moves is indicative of 60 frames per second. Let's look at the interview with Yosuke Okanari and Naoki Hori of Sega on their arcade game Outrun. And I quote, "Outrun is the only game from the era of Sega arcade games that ran at 30 frames per second. All other ones ran at 60 frames per second. When you played the Sega Saturn version, normally it would run just like the arcade version at 30 frames per second. By putting in a cheat code, you could run the game at 60 frames per second." End quote. And the funny thing about that is, the Saturn could run the game at 60 frames per second, but the Saturn is not compatible with component cables. Interesting. So, I bet you're all wondering, how the hell did the Sega Saturn run a game at 60 frames per second? How did old consoles like the NES, the Genesis, and arcades do 60 frames per second if what Trey says is true and they can only do 30 without component? Let Professor Bond educate you. Sit down, relax, put your feet up, grab some popcorn. First, we have both vector and raster displays for arcades, but that's self-explanatory. I don't need to talk about that. But what about consoles? See, for consoles, and in America, whatever you want to call it, our region, the NTSC standard is 480 lines of resolution drawn at 60 fields a second. In interlaced video, 2 fields compose 1 frame. Therefore, 480i video is 30 frames per second. However, the trick back then was to output at a 240p signal half the signal. This means that while a 240p is still 60 fields per second, it is now also 60 frames per second. A frame only needed the resolution of 1 field to be displayed. The consoles also tried to trick the timing of the video signals to draw the odd and even lines of a frame in the same place. This is why the scan lines look so big on games. In short, 480i is 60 fields per second and 30 frames per second. 240p is 60 fields per second and 60 frames per second. Now, whether or not the hardware can run the game fast enough to constantly provide the updated fields at that rate is a different matter. And if you're a long-time gamer who's played on games during the NES era, I'm sure you've known what happens and experienced it, what happens when the hardware can't keep up. So while we didn't get progressive scan until EDTVs at 480p, 60 frames per second was still possible on a regular CRT. Deal with it.